Hey, thank you for joining us today for the PPM Insights webcast, which happens on the second Thursday of every month at 11 Eastern. So we've got a lively half hour ahead with a leading PPM expert today for some fresh perspectives and expert takes on project and portfolio management hot topics. Plus, we do have a live Q&A at the end. So save your questions. We will be taking those on here in a few minutes. And as always, you can continue the discussion in the comments section of the popular PPM Insights blog at the CA Communities. So this week's featured expert is Paula Barrack, who has coached companies in industries from healthcare to telecom to transportation, and has been a trusted advisor to C-level and senior executive leadership. So we're very, very happy that you were able to join us today, Paul. We've talked about this topic so many times, and there are so many strong opinions about how to adopt Agile values and principles into an organization. But that transition period always seems to end up to be a hot topic. Now, you've worked with a lot of companies who have found ways to make this work despite some of the inevitable obstacles that happen during those business transformation efforts. So there are some common actions that can be taken to start getting immediate benefits where the only investment really is commitment, right? You know, I've heard this quote from you many, many times. So how do people bring it together to work better together when we're talking about a mixed or a hybrid environment?
Yeah, Lisa, that's a good question, and it's something that happens a lot, and I've experienced through the years. In fact, many times I didn't even realize I was working Agile until much, much later on. In fact, last year, as part of an internal initiative at CA, I was part of a Tiger team that included some of the top Agilists that we have in the organization, and I was feeling a little bit out of my depth in many respects, and still do when I talk to them about Agile, and I'm on that journey right now of learning. And when I explained some of my thoughts in terms of what agility was and how it played out, and then some of my experiences on some of the projects that I've been working on, you know, my favorite moment was when I was talking to Dima Dajani at a conference back in September of last year, and she got this great smile on her face, this Dima. And if anybody's knows Dima, knows she gets this great smile on her face. She said, "Well, congratulations, you've been working Agile." And I was like, "But she says, doesn't matter what the tools are, but you've embodied the spirit of Agile and how you were working." And so that was an epiphany for me as I was starting to look into it. The organizations I'd worked for as a consultant and on many of the projects that I did weren't fully Agile, had no real intent to move towards Agile, but we're simply looking for a more efficient and a more effective way of working. And there's some characteristics there that we went in through and tried to apply in order to make our teams more effective, more efficient, and to gain some pretty substantial successes. And those are some of the things I'm going to share today as we go through this talk. So, you know, a couple of topics we're going to talk about here as we go through this, and I'll delve into these in a little more details, is it's about putting the people first in how you approach this. So if you're in a hybrid environment, you're thinking about Agile, or if you're not thinking about Agile, how can you make your teams work more efficient? How can you be more efficient in that sense? And one of the key principles of the Agile Manifesto is putting people first. It's one of those key values. We'll talk a little bit about that. Emphasizing on that short-term success, towards the longer-term transformation. So whether you're working on a project towards a specific scope or outcome, focusing on those short-term values, what you've been successful at achieving in the short term, because each journey, each project is a series of incremental steps to get to where you need to go. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then talking about your modality of work. How are you actually working physically? And the power of co-location, whether that's virtual or physical, and how that can be effective in bringing your teams together in order to do that, and how that all kind of combines together to potentially become a springboard to being more agile in a, frankly, non-agile environment, which may be a pretty powerful scenario to kind of delve into there. So let's talk a little bit about people. So if we think about the Agile Manifesto, it really has, there's a lot of stuff in it, but the parts that resonated the most with me when I first learned about agility and Agile many years ago, and then kind of got refreshed a little bit later on, were the values of focusing on individuals and interactions over process and tools. That's a really important message as we go through that, and I'll explain why in a little bit. The other aspect of that is, working software over comprehensive documentation. So focusing on, focusing on the wins and what you're doing to translate that another way. And then collaboration as a big deal on that, and then being able to respond to that change over following some sort of a rigid plan as you're doing that. Now, planning is important, so I don't want to discount that. But when you think about this and you think about the environments in which you're working, the environments in which you're functioning, traditional waterfall, I think most people would agree, can be very rigid in how you're approaching it. We have to follow this process for reporting risks. We have to follow that process for completing a change request. And then the corresponding procedures associated with it. It feels like you're on rails, to use some of the jargon that our marketing folks sometimes use and our sales folks use when they're talking to folks, but it really does. It feels like you're constantly going down a single path, and you really can't get off that path to do something, even though you think you should or feel you should to be able to do that. Well, it's not necessarily effective in terms of doing that, but in the context of a project that you might be working on, context of your department or your organization, if you think about how people are functioning in that environment, there's a high degree of frustration. I doubt there's anybody on this talk or call who can't think of a time when they felt brutally frustrated by a corporate procedure or corporate policy that is in place, or a process that's in place that frankly doesn't make sense in 25–30% of the cases that they're dealing with. So how do we effectively change that and think about that? Well, we do that by focusing on the goals and leaving it up to the individuals that comprise that team and that team to achieve those goals. Give them and empower them to help achieve the goals in the context of the project or the work that you're asking them to do as they're starting to do that. And correspondingly, that means that you focus on the wins so that they can build the confidence of that team. And how do we do that as we think about that is by celebrating some of those daily successes. So if we think about what those wins might represent, and let me give you an example of how we did this. Large organization that I worked with a few years ago before I came out of the field, a very large project, had a very demoralized team when I stepped in. And it was a team that was very upset, not having a good time, feeling like they weren't successful at what they were doing, feeling like they were being crapped on all the time as far as how they approached their work and got things done. Yet they knew that they were being successful, but nobody else seemed to in terms of what they did. So how do we fix that? Well, it was one of the things I learned from some Agile training that I'd taken and some courses and some coaching that had been given to me, which was celebrate the successes. So if we're thinking about this as a team, then let's put the successes in our team room up on the whiteboard. So just something as simple as that was, what was your win for today? And we would have them put on the whiteboard. Everybody would get up and we'd have a little ceremony at the end of the day. And again, we're working waterfall, we're not working Agile. And it was just, what did you do today, Paul? What was your success for today? And it didn't have to be a professional success. It could have been a personal success, but it was something meant to improve the morale. Now, I'll continue to elaborate on this story as we kind of go through this talk, because there's some additional successes and examples where that worked quite well and went through on that particular team. They did a lot of things right. But the point being is that it really helped them focus on being successful. And not only that, but anytime somebody came into the room, a key stakeholder, whenever we'd have meetings in there, they would ask about that board, and they would kind of say, what does that represent? Well, this represents the wins that our team had in this particular area or this particular day, and how we'd build forward on that and how we would make that happen. So it was really important as a morale boost for the team, number one, and number two, it was really important because it helped demonstrate incremental success to the stakeholders that were regularly coming in and out of the room to collaborate with us on the work that they were asking us to do, so they could see visibly what the progress is. And it's not just that one project. Another project I did about 8 years ago in Toronto, same scenario. We had a giant sticky board. Don Firestein, one of our project managers, would get up there and he'd have a giant post-it note up there, and he'd have the sticky notes there that kind of say, here's what we've done. And he'd have check boxes next to all the different things that we had completed to be able to demonstrate to the sponsor, and that would come into the team room that we had the CA team parked in, what we had accomplished and what we did over a particular time to be able to demonstrate success on that front. So being able to do that and show that success was a real morale boost on very difficult projects in order to be successful in terms of doing that. But more importantly, the sponsorship and leadership there gave us the authority, the ability, and the capability and the goals, clear goals, that allowed us to be successful. So we were able to let the team form in how they approach things. So if you think about it from an Agile perspective and how we're looking at items, it becomes a how you think about things in the approach for delivering the efforts that you're trying to accomplish at a customer. Focus on the people, making sure that that team comes together, and focusing on making sure that they're there and making sure that team composition is right. Just because you have a team that for a marketing project doesn't necessarily mean that same team composition is the right one for an IT project or something along those lines. So sort of building into that is looking at the short-term success and long-term transformation that some organizations need to follow, who are following that traditional waterfall approach may not be in that headspace of doing a full-blown rip-off-the-bandage Agile transformation. It's something that when I've gone into customers and thought, hey, they could really benefit from Agile here, and I've actually suggested it sometimes, I've come across folks that's just like, no, they think of it as a buzzword, as something instead of the powerful thing that it is. But realistically, there's ways to be able to do this and to accomplish this without getting into the mix of doing a full-blown transformation. You can incrementally get there. I often think of one of my customers up in Ottawa, up in Canada. There's the old saying, right? We gotta walk before we can, crawl, walk, run. They added another one to that, was let's just roll over first before we can crawl, before we can walk, before we can run. And really what we're talking about here is exactly that. This is the rollover step. It's a way of being able to demonstrate some of that short-term success to get us to the longer-term marathon and to grow into something that's much more agile to be able to do that. So one of the key things is that in past projects that we've found, or that I've found to be very, very powerful, and we encourage folks who have done this, is that once in a while a customer asks us, well, can we get a pre-sales environment to manage our project in, or get a demo box stood up in our own environment that we can manage the project in order to do that? Well, depending on your circumstances, the answer might be yes. And if that's the case, then being able to demonstrate using the tool, being able to demonstrate and show incremental progress becomes very powerful at that part using PPM or Agile Central for that matter. But one of the important aspects of this, and I'll give you a good example of this in a waterfall context. I had another very large customer that the sponsor had very clear goals. He wanted to understand where more than $1 billion worth of IT investment spend was going on a regular basis, and he had very little transparency beyond a few very large buckets, about 4 or 5 large buckets. And he had zero transparency into the operational activities that were going on. His ask of us was, how long would it take for me to deploy PPM in our organization so that we could get that transparency into that financial information? Well, having just spent 6 weeks doing a road mapping exercise for them and understanding what was going on, it was pretty clear that it was going to be no small journey. We're talking close to a year in order to get them to where they were at, due to culture, due to technical debt that they had in their organization with respect to different applications that would be feeding PPM, and so on. Yet, he wanted some quick wins, and so we decided to focus on small incremental progress with a few stakes in the ground a little later on down the line. So the first stake in the ground that we had was, let's be able to show what the labor financials were going to be for their organization for projects and for operational activities in the first 6 months. That was a reasonable and achievable goal for us to do. And each week, every time we did a status report, we would actually demonstrate what we did. So not only were we using PPM in order to manage the project, but we were able to do the demo, have a little ceremony and demonstrate exactly what it was that we had deployed or what we had built the previous week, to be able to demonstrate the configuration items that we had done, to be able to demonstrate the new business intelligence that we were bringing to the organization that were adjunct to the overarching goal to be able to do that. the feedback that we had received from that executive was that this was the only project that he absolutely knew what was going on at every step of the way, could clearly articulate to his leadership and the board exactly what was happening, and we were moving at a pace faster than any other project in that organization had in the previous 15 years. So it was really quite spectacular to kind of be able to do that, and the focus on the demonstration really gave something tangible for the team to hang their hats on and work towards each time that we were doing that. And what this also did is it took away the traditional status reporting where you're droning away, just simply saying, yes, our risks are this, and we have trends that are doing this, the financials are this, and so on. It transformed it into a more interactive conversation where we were able to kind of say, yeah, here's what we learned, here's what we built, here's where the problems that we had with, and then next week here's where we're planning on being, but we foresee some issues here and some challenges here. So this sounds very agile, doesn't it, when I describe that? Yet we were working in a waterfall context. This is one of the examples I was talking to Dima about and other colleagues as well, where they all kind of said, yeah, you were effectively working agile and not even really realizing it. So that regular cadence that we would put in place to be able to focus on the short-term successes allowed us to achieve that goal of the longer-term transformation. We literally had people as well, I would just sort of parenthetically, in that project, we literally had somebody in the room who was a bit of a Debbie Downer, who literally laughed when I came into the room and announced what our deadline was for getting this out the door and said there's no possible way we could accomplish that. Well, not only did we accomplish it, but we actually accomplished it about 4 weeks in advance of what our projected timeline was, or what our committed timeline was. So it was a pretty powerful statement to be able to kind of effectively do that, and we did it in a waterfall environment just by applying some of these simple agile approaches, this agile mindset. I don't even necessarily call them approaches, might be too strong a word, but this agile mindset where we were collaborating together and whatnot in the room. Now, this sounds kind of like a nirvana as to how we approach that, but this gets to kind of the co-location conversation as we start to look into that. So again, if you update your project forums and if no one responds, then it doesn't really matter how you actually collaborate if people aren't actually collaborating. So you can have all of the tool sets in place, you can have all of the fancy gadgets and so on that are in place, but that's just not effective if people aren't using it. So what makes it more effective as you're approaching this? How do you make a virtual team work? How do you make a physical co-location work? And I'm going to talk a little bit now about how that plays out a little bit to be able to effectively manage your teams and get some additional productivity out of the mix as you're doing that. So physical co-location is often not possible, but it's kind of an ideal scenario. So that project I was referring to earlier was extremely effective because we had a single war room, and it was shaped in a horseshoe. And at the center of that horseshoe, in the middle of the horseshoe, was myself as the senior architect, the project manager, and a conference table. So whenever we did requirements, whenever we had conversations around that, the stakeholders would come into the room and would participate. Everybody on the team, assuming they didn't have anything else, it was a reasonably large team. There was 20 people in that room normally, without the stakeholders or other participants, who would work in that room. And they would be able to listen to the requirements as they were as they were building it out. So not only did they actually hear what the requirement was, but they could actually hear what the intent of the requirement was. Because everybody's probably been on a project at some point in time where you listen to a requirement and you're going, huh, what's that all about? And you don't really get the intent behind that requirement. Well, that's one of the advantages of this co-location, being able to physically co-locate everybody in the room and have your stakeholders come into the room, is that the whole room can read into and interpret what the actual intent of the requirement is, which means solutioning for the team becomes much more effective because you can pivot as to what the intent behind that requirement is, and change the requirement to affect and to reflect the intent behind what was actually being said. So that's one of the powerful things about co-location as you're doing that. And again, that team composition is really important when you're pulling that together, making sure that you have your testers, you have your coders, your developers, your consultants in there and any project SMEs that are part of the regular team all co-located so they can collaborate effectively. You know, it's very easy for us to kind of be on this project and reach out and say, hey, Bob, what do you think about this? Or, hey, Sri, what do you think about that? Or, you know, hey, Ryan, what's going on over here? Where are we at on this one? Or, you know, some of the other aspects that you might have some of the questions. It's very easy to do that when you're physically co-located and you have a much tighter team, and the risk is substantially reduced that you're going to miss your deadlines because you actually know that. Now, does that mean that you're working in a pure agile way? Sounds agile. Is it pure agile? Probably not, because we're still working towards a work breakdown structure, a task list, tracking things, risk issues, and change requests. And in many respects, we were actually working much faster than what the traditional waterfall processes of that particular organization would allow. So by the time a change request had, we were submitting a change request, and that change would come through, if it needed funding, odds were pretty good. We'd actually built out or completed what the scope of the change request before any funding had been required or requested. So we simply just looked for what was the change in scope and how would we actually approach it if there was no material change in schedule and dollars. So it became a very effective way when you're physically co-locating in a room to be able to build that out and to make that happen. So again, you're incrementally adding Agile in a waterfall environment. Now, where this became even better for us is when that organization, shortly before I rolled off the project and one of my colleagues took over for me, they started introducing Agile into the mix, and they did start to do that. Well, this team was ready for that, and it wasn't, and so that friction that often happens in a hybrid organization was lessened to a great degree because the team was already working in a somewhat agile fashion. They weren't necessarily using the language as rigidly as they possibly should, but they had no problem being able to keep up with and upping their pace when the agile approach started coming into the organization. So what about virtual co-location? That's another powerful way of being able to collaborate and to introduce some of this as well. This is effective in large disparate teams. Now, how do you do this? Virtual co-location is, there's a lot of great tools out there, so WebEx and virtual conferences and all that kind of fun stuff to be able to do the collaborate. Now, I will tell you one way that I've found that works really, really effectively for bringing this stuff together and to helping achieve the success associated with being agile, but in a non-agile environment. Now, I'll give you some productivity statistics here. We did this about 8 years ago in another customer that had 40. I think it was about 45 portlets, custom portlets that we needed to develop, and these were not, these were not easy portlets. This was part of the old portfolio management construct that we needed to build out, and those portlets were very, very complex in how we did it. 45 of them. We also had 10 to 15 pretty complex custom workflows that needed to be built out, a bunch of different custom objects, and I had to come up with an algorithm for calculating internal rate of return 4 different ways for this particular customer, which was not a fun thing to do. It was really, actually IRR was calculated the same way, it was just different inputs that went into it. Regardless, the point being is that we had individuals that were around the world, in Israel, in Japan, in 3 different time zones in North America, and in EMEA as well, so folks in France and in Germany. So it was a pretty complex team to work with across the world to be able to make that happen. Again, we were working waterfall for how we approached this. Now, what did we do in order to accomplish an unreasonable deadline to get this out the door in about 2 months? What we did is we actually set up a bridge during regular working hours. So we had a team working agreement that we would get on a bridge at a particular time during the day, the project manager and myself as the senior architect. And we would be on that bridge until the end of the day, the end of the working time, and sometimes beyond in order to accommodate some of the usual time frames that we had. And people would call in order to validate the requirements, in order to let us know what the testing was, to update the issues logs that we were maintaining for the coding and all the stuff that was going on. And that's how a team of about 7 people were able to produce 45 complex portlets, 40 to 45 complex portlets, 10 to 15 complex workflows get them out the door and configure a pretty complex environment with a bunch of custom objects and a bunch of dashboards and get it out the door in a little over 2 months. It was a pretty powerful way of working for us, and it was one of the first epiphanies that I had that, hey, there's a better way of working out there, and that better way of working, you know, and at the time I didn't know that that's what Agile really was and how that would actually play out. But that better way of working could be done in the context of a waterfall project and traditional project construct. Ever since that first experience I had doing that is when I started thinking about how can I start to approach this? How can I do this? How can we build this out and make this something as a part of the way that I work on a regular basis? Now, it's not always practical. You know, I don't want to set unrealistic expectations. But if you can make this happen, if you can bring your team to the table physically or through a co-location aspect, you'll see some of those benefits as you're starting to build out and be successful as you're starting to go through there. You know, so it works well with disparate teams and how you're playing out. But it's important that you have that team mixed correctly as you're starting to build it. So how do you start doing this yourself? How do you get to this, you know, how do you do this rollover maneuver to get to the point where you can crawl before you can walk and then run in an agile way? Well, number one, go to the Agile Manifesto and think about those values. How can I, in the context of my organization, apply that thought process and apply the idea of putting individuals' interactions over processes? Right? Don't be married to your processes. They are important, especially in organizations that are highly regulated. But at the same time, you need to give flexibility in order to do that. Making sure that you focus on something that works, right? As you do that. Focusing on collaboration and making sure that the right people are having the right interactions as they do that, and be responsive to change. Don't be rigid in your thinking. That's that's the value of Agile and Agile thinking as you apply it. That doesn't mean that you have to work in a very rigid fashion or throw all of your processes out, magically rip the Band-Aid off and do that. That there is benefit to that, but if you can't do that in your organization, this is one way of starting to embody some of that. So if your company hasn't bought into Agile, then this is the way. This is the rollover, as I said, to get people to think in that Agile context. So if you can show benefits by applying some of these approaches, thinking in terms of co-location, thinking in terms of collaboration, and just having better team dynamics in a waterfall context, it's a way of demonstrating that Agile works. And you can start to act as an agent of change within the organization to bring that full circle and hopefully advance that Agile thought process throughout the organization as you're doing it. And it doesn't have to be an expensive endeavor in order to do that. You can pick 1 or 2 small projects in order to do this and focus on delivering and applying and saying, here's how you're going to work. We're going to give you the goals. You guys figure out how you're going to achieve the goals. Give us incremental value as you go through that. And by the way, we still want to see your work breakdown structure, your risk issues and change requests, and all the status reports and all that sort of fun stuff. But that doesn't mean that the team can't work the way the team wants to work, right? So we break apart stuff into silos right now. Developers over here, in one part of the organization, one physical location, business analysts over here, and so on. Bring them together. Prove that this works in your organization. It doesn't have to be a big expense in order to do that. And by doing that, these small techniques helps turn the story around from one of sort of the traditional log jams of waterfall, and whether you're using Prince2, PMBOK, or whatever the case is, you can demonstrate success. Again, the most successful projects I've worked on have embodied some of these principles of absolute collaboration, deep trust in the team, and having a team that forms and storms and just absolutely kicks it and knocks it out of the park when they're doing really, really well. Probably the biggest expense around this and the biggest commitment that you have to make in your organization for you to start being successful around this is to make sure that your team is dedicated. As somebody who is, and that was something that was an insight that I kind of only had after talking to my Agile colleagues, and it seems kind of obvious, but it is the way it is. That dedicated team is important to making sure that you have consistency in that forming those relationships and those bonds that happen in the context of work and what you're trying to deliver are formed, and that the team learns to trust each other and can begin to deliver on what it is they say that they are and what they're being asked to deliver on. So that's sort of the key things in terms of how you can start to get started on this, is making sure that you do that. And again, it just doesn't have to be a giant, rip off the Band-Aid approach to introducing Agile to your organization. You can introduce it in a waterfall organization, in a waterfall context. This is, again, if you're not doing this as a large organization or a large initiative, this is a way to introduce Agile and Agile thinking into your teams, into your organization, and to help being successful in trying to develop some context around there. So with that, I'm going to open us up for some questions at this point.
Great, thanks, Paul, and great perspectives. I think one of the things that really resonates with me when you talk about this topic is ways to get around the all or nothing thinking. That it doesn't have to be an either or choice. That it is a process. And I really like that analogy of the rollover before you crawl, before you walk, before you run. So we do have a couple of questions for you. Leading off, one of them, let's give you the fun one first. So when you have an Agile team and a Waterfall team together, do you have suggestions on setting expectations for how you're going to approach differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this is a question that pops up quite regularly. So it's actually kind of funny. It makes me think of a story. Last year at CA World, a woman approached me from one of our customers, and she's like, "How are you guys?" It was from an organization that was pure Agile, and she's like, "Well, how can you guys be pushing, pushing PPM and whatnot? That's a step backwards," and so on. The reality is that we're not trying to say go to PPM or go completely Agile. You need to figure out what's right for you. Now, in terms of getting teams that are Agile in a hybrid organization, teams collaborating and working together between each other, part of that is coming up with a strong working agreement between the two sides of the fence. I wrote about this in my blog a while back, where the language that is used is often one of the biggest barriers that you have for being able to overcome that scenario. Learning to communicate across those teams can be a challenge. But once you do that, you can establish a working agreement for how you collaborate. I'll think of a customer actually I was at about a month and a half ago, and they had a pretty decent way of doing it. 3 major silos in this multi-billion-dollar organization. They do about $4 billion a year in new product business that they sell. And 3 parts of the organization. One was working Agile, and the other 2, one was not, and one was a hybrid approach and was still trying to grow Agile in their organization. They were leveraging a lot of the organizational history that they had there and the inertia and the relationships that they had. So again, that focus on people, that they just picked up the phone and kind of tried to explain to each other what they were trying to do. So the same context, the same thing is possible at the team level, where you can reach out to the team and collaborate. We do that inside of CA. When we talk to, from a waterfall perspective, many of our projects are still delivered in a waterfall approach when we work with our customers, but we're now shifting towards an Agile delivery approach, and that conversation has to happen as well. In the past, for example, we've seen where we work in an Agile fashion, but the customer doesn't. So what does that mean? Well, it wasn't really Agile because the team was not dedicated. Neither the customer, or maybe it was us that didn't dedicate the staff fully on that front. But communicating between the 2 teams, you really need to make sure that you have a working agreement for one on the language aspect of what it is, what your cadence is, what the goals and outcomes are that you're trying to achieve for the work that you're looking to share across the teams, and how you're going to share the results of that work on an ongoing basis, whether that's a status report, whether it's end of sprint demos, whatever the case may be. Just don't be rigid in your thinking as to how you approach. We're people, and if you focus on the people, you're going to accomplish things a lot more rather than sort of the rigid process. So don't get hung up on the process is I think sort of the key crux there, and trust in the people that want to do a good job and have positive intent for what you're trying to accomplish.
Good point, good point. And a lot of the questions that are coming in seem to be spanning this whole, working together thing. So if you do have questions, you can click on the Q&A button on your WebEx window there, and enter your question. We'll take them in order. Next question for you. Boy, this is a hot seat question, so get ready for it. What about executive or sponsor pushback when you change an approach on a project and you're working with both types of teams? How do you handle that?
Oh boy, that is a good one. Well, I'll tell you exactly how we handled it. So that project I was referring to earlier was a large government organization that shall remain nameless. We were at what would be the equivalent to the C-suite when we were having these conversations. And there was actually a lot of friction at that level initially until we were able to prove it out. So the proof is really in the pudding. We kind of did it in a somewhat subversive manner, if that makes sense. And that subversive manner was simply by doing it. We started off by looking at how can we be more effective, how can we be more agile in our approach to doing this, and applying some of the ceremonies and some of the things that I had learned as an architect and had learned from others, how we could be more effective at collaborating. And the executives that we were working with, they didn't really care much about, whether it was called Agile or what it was. All they were really caring about was the results. Part of the challenge that we face as agents of change in an organization is that people get married to particular thought process, particular thought patterns, and particular ideas. We have people that are very rigid and process-oriented, and we need to do it exactly this way, and it must be done this way. And then we have people that are at the other end of the spectrum. The vast majority of us are somewhere in the middle. The idea is to be pragmatic with these individuals. Sometimes you're going to win the fight. Sometimes you're not. The reality is that you need to just make sure that they're informed as to what it is that you're looking to do, that you establish clear goals or have clear goals from the executives as to the work that they want to get done, and that you have clear incremental stakes in the ground that you're working towards that you can communicate to the executives to be able to show. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the executive doesn't really care how you get there, as long as it's done in a quality fashion, it's done in an ethical and honest fashion as well, and that you get out the door what you say you're going to get out the door. So typically the results are the results generally prove out and help eliminate that friction that might happen at the executive level. It's been my experience, I've seen this in customers recently, that can be symptomatic of something that's a little bit more out of our pay grade, so to speak. So typically a political fight, somebody's trying to make a name for themselves, or somebody's trying to tear somebody down, whatever the case may be. Regardless, that's irrelevant to us. What's relevant is making sure that the work gets done. And at the end of the day, if the work gets done in a way that all parties agree, that stuff tends to take care of itself.
So basically, it doesn't matter what you call it, so long as you get the outcome.
Exactly.
Essentially. Looks like we've got one more question for you. Can you give some more detail on how an open bridge works on a project with a virtual team? Do you have fixed check-in times besides having an open line for questions?
So yeah, that's a great question. So from a practical perspective, and I'll give you the consultant answer, it kind of depends on where you are in the life cycle of the project. So at the outset of the project, when you're doing requirements, that open bridge is, we would do that at set times, and we'd have regular check-ins for when that would occur. As we started getting into the crux of the development work, what we would do is we would just have that line open. We would expect people to call in, and they would put themselves on mute if they didn't have any questions, and they would code away, or they would develop their portlets or whatever the case may be. And if they had any questions or clarification on requirements or specifications, they would just unmute themselves, ask the questions, and then when they were done, they would, hand it off to the customer, who would actually be on the call with us and ready to be able to test. So it was a really efficient and effective way of doing it. So again, at the outset, when you think about from a virtual co-location perspective, do you need to be on there all day long? Probably not. But later on, when you're actually in the thick of things, and you're getting closer to go live, and you're getting closer to testing, and you're looking to do things, makes more sense at that point in time. But you kind of need to read the situation and understand the tempo of what it is that you're doing and the timelines that you're working on in order to do that. So the closer you are to that go live and the need to work faster, that's when you really kind of need to start to get on that phone and stay on that phone and do the virtual co-location. So again, we had a WebEx up that people could pop in, start sharing their screen, ask questions. We would update the documentation on the fly to reflect changes in specifications and so on. And we would have them validated by the customer, who again was part of that call as well. So it wasn't just the the consulting team, the contractor team. It was the customer as well that was a part of that as well. So the whole thing moved really, really fast, really effectively, and we got a quality product out the door for the customer.
Great. And that's all that matters. That is actually the last question that's come in. So I want to thank you, Paul, for joining us today. And for those of you listening, be sure to follow Paul on Twitter at PaulBarrackCA. You can also check out the PPM Insights blog, where you can continue today's conversation in the comments. And, of course, check out the CA PPM community on CA Communities at communities.ca.com. It's a great resource for getting advice and insights from fellow users around the world, experts from across CA. Plus, on the community site, you also find the PPM Insights webcast archive, where you can listen to earlier recordings, download the presentations, and check out similar topics across the community. So thank you again for joining us today. Join us again next month on the second Thursday for another PPM Insights topic. Next month we have Emma Price joining us, who's going to be talking about how to create a workflow today. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate your time.